Hello, and welcome to this movie review special of the Poisons and Pestilence podcast. This week, we're looking at The Expanse with Emily Ricotta. Today, we're very, very lucky to be joined by Dr. Emily Ricotta, who's going to talk us through fungus. And we're going to be talking about The Expanse. And I'm hoping, even though I have watched it and I really enjoyed it, I'm hoping Emily doesn't ask me any specific questions about plot or characters, because they have, to some extent, much like the proto-molecule, which we're going to focus on today, blurred into some massive cacophony. So, Emily, to get us started, tell us a little bit about yourself and the area you work in.
Great. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. So I am an assistant professor of epidemiology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland. Not everybody knows about USU, but it's a really cool place. We provide medical and graduate training in the health sciences for the armed service members as well as civilians. I work in the Department of Preventive Medicine and Biostatistics, and because I am an infectious disease epidemiologist, I like to focus on all things infectious. I study risk factors for diseases, how things get transmitted, and I'm really sort of disease agnostic. As long as it's infectious, I'm on board. And so today I'm here to talk about fungus. I will say I'm not a mycologist, but I do study invasive fungal infections in humans, as well as in some vectors. And so we can get into talking about that. Quick disclaimer, all of these opinions, as well as all of the wacky theories I'm going to have today, are my own, not that of USIS or the U.S. government. But I'm really excited to be here, and space fungus is one of my favorite topics.
So, after you suggested The Expanse, which I'd started years ago, and then I got distracted by another box set, and I've come back to it. I've really enjoyed it, and it's the proto-molecule in it which is the most relevant to our series as we think about biological and chemical weapons. And this proto-molecule we're going to get into, and when you reached out to me, you mentioned the fact that, well, actually, if you think about the proto-molecule, it might be kind of like a fungus, and there's this whole kind of relationship between these ideas. And that certainly got me thinking about it as the show progressed, and it helped me make sense of it a little bit more. So I guess to start, before we go down some of the side roads we're inevitably going to wander down, could you give me a 101 in relation to infectious fungus and fungus as a kind of infectious disease?
Absolutely. So fungus is, to me, one of the coolest organisms. It's one of the oldest organisms on Earth. It was the first organism, it's believed to be the first organism that actually was able to come out of the primordial waters on Earth and establish itself. Before we had plants, we had fungus. We had huge fungal structures on ancient Earth. And it's really because of fungus that we were able to have plants, that we were able to develop a biosphere, that we were able to even have an immune system. And so fungi are they're really cool. There's so many of them. They're massive. So everywhere on Earth, you will be able to find fungal species. The little networks that they create connect everything that we're finding. And so fungi, they're neither bacteria nor viruses. They're not a parasite. They are their own fungal kingdom in the tree of life. And they're organisms that really help us and help plants process nutrients and break down things. And humans would not be alive without them. We have fungus in our microbiome. We have fungus that helps us break down different, things that we eat. We use fungus all throughout the agricultural system. We use it to make beer. No beer without fungus. We use it. We can actually, there are fungal species that break down oil. And so we've used them for cleaning up oil spills. And it's just been incredibly fascinating. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I have learned from this really great book. It's called The Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. So if you're at all interested in learning more about what I'm talking about, pick up this book, because a lot of what I know really comes from there. But, because it is this environmental organism, it means it's out there, and it means that, like anything else, humans can get infected with it. Luckily, humans have co-evolved with fungi, and so we have pretty robust immune systems to handle fungi. So we have a very specific part of our immune system that really is fungal specific, and we also happen to have body temperatures that are a high enough temperature that fungi can't really grow at those temperatures. And so even if we do get, fungi into ourselves, and we inhale spores all the time. Fungi is just floating through. So even if we inhale it or it gets into a cut or something, the majority of the time our body is able to take care of that, clear out the fungal infection. It's no problem. Now, there are situations where that is not the case. So if you have a defect in your immune pathway, one of the fungal specific immune pathways, you can develop very severe, debilitating, life-threatening fungal infections. When we had the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we had a lot of service members who received blast injuries that then developed invasive fungal infections because they had just plant earth matter would get into the wound, and because the service members were immunocompromised from receiving blood transfusions, they would then develop very severe invasive fungal infections. And you've been hearing probably a lot about Candida auris in the news. This is a fungal organism that is maybe a little more heat tolerant. It's getting a little more, resistant to being able to survive at these higher temperatures. And so if it gets into people, that first line of defense isn't as strong as we would like it to be. And so it kind of weakens the human's ability to respond. And so we're at this very interesting sort of understanding of human immunity, fungal biology, as well as dealing with climate change and everything. And so fungus as an infectious disease is a really interesting topic. It's a little understudied right now. I don't know if you've done The Last of Us yet, but the first scene in The Last of Us where he talks about a fungal outbreak being what keeps him up at night, it's what keeps me up at night too. Like, it's not the flu, it's not, COVID was terrible, but if we had a fungus that got out and into and could actually spread through the human population like that, boy, oh boy, we'd be in trouble. Because fungi are those cells are more closely related to human cells. And so we have a harder time treating for fungal diseases. We target antivirals, antibacterials, target proteins in these organisms that we as humans don't have. But fungi share a lot of the same systems that humans do. And so if we give an antifungal, a lot of times it's very toxic to our bodies as well. And so we have trouble treating them. We don't have vaccines against them. It becomes a whole big problem.
The lovely book you recommended just then, the Merlin Sheldrake book, I thought was excellent. And it reminded me of reading like Humboldt and some of the really early 19th century biologists and ecologists, because it has this kind of, well, in part because it's systems theory, but it's a very human kind of feel in it. It's a very curiosity-driven study. It made me feel that feeling of first reading about fungi and also reading about parasitology and those sorts of things. You realize the elegance of some of these systems, but also their complexity, but the fact that they find these niches which are really incredible in how, and then they specialize to such a great extent. And also the fact that I think with fungi, it's the fact that many of the niches they find and specialize in aren't immediately clear to humans. We can't, we see a bird with wings, we think, oh, it flies, that's great. But we haven't, we don't necessarily have our same empathy with looking at this fungus sat there on the ground doing nothing or spring. And yet, some of the ways they do it is incredible. And I'm reading about some of the mats you see that cover many kilometers and the communication pathways within these things. The fact that the fruiting is probably the least exciting bit of the life of the mushroom.
Right? The mushroom is the least interesting bit of it.
And in particular, looking at this idea of, well, it is how we characterize it. And it certainly made me think about things like prions and viruses, this idea of, is it alive? Is it not alive? And I guess that also takes us in, well, obviously it's a living organism, but in a sense of how we categorize it in relation to other organisms. Mm-hmm. It doesn't move. So we think, oh, it's a plant, basically, but it has much more in common with maybe more sort of mobile microorganisms we see out and about there. So yeah, it's fascinating. So we're going to talk about The Expanse today.
Yes.
Aren't we? Why don't you talk me through the series and how you got into the series, and then we can maybe after that talk about the proto-molecule and how we're going to be talking about that today.
May I ask you something? Do you miss Earth? Endless blue skies and open water all the way to the horizon.
The hell is she doing way out here?
I have something for you. Little lost daughter case. I need someone discreet.
Say no more.
Julie Mao discovered something that would tip the balance of power. Someone will do anything to keep it quiet.
Some kind of game being played here. If you really do want to stop it, then let's go.
You want to be careful how far you take this.
Earth is over. This is something new.
I'm a big sci-fi nerd. I love Star Trek. I love Star Wars. I love space. I love the potential that is out there. I mean, there's just no way. I do statistics. There's just no way that humans are the only life that exists out there. It's just mathematically an impossibility. We could get into Fermi's paradox all you want later, but there's just so much out there and just so much different out there. And I think one of the things that we should definitely touch on today is, what is life? What we think as organic life and is alive on Earth, maybe that isn't the same thing. We've had discussions here about, silicon-based life forms. Are those a thing? And so I think that's one of the reasons that I really like sci-fi shows, especially, Star Trek. They talk a lot about what is life? What's that definition? What's out there? Let's go, let's explore, let's meet. And so The Expanse really, I think, is just another good example of space exploration and learning what's out there. Now, unfortunately, we could get into a bit about, why humans do what humans do and how maybe we shouldn't be traveling the stars because we get into some bad things. But yeah, that's how I got into The Expanse. Somebody had recommended the first book, Leviathan Wakes, written by James Corey, many years ago, and I didn't draw the connection between the two until I sat and watched the first episode and went, this sounds really familiar. So full disclosure, I have only read the first two books. I have not read the rest of the series, but I have seen all of the show.
So the proto-molecule is an interesting one. So for me, when I watched this show, knowing what I was going to be talking about it on here, and thank goodness I did, because I think I will have to go back and read the books to keep on top of some of the relationships and links in that series. But for me, I put the proto-molecule, that was my character. That's who I was there for. And so I kind of watched the world revolve around this idea as it evolved in the first couple of series. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about how the proto-molecule is introduced in the first series? And I guess then start to talk about the type of characteristics he's described. We can maybe put some fresh light on the characterization of this organism.
Well, the way it is introduced is that, there's a disaster that happens, and all of a sudden, oh no, what has happened on Arrows Station? Why is there, and here is this a virus? Is it an infection? Is it some sort of weapon? What's happening? And then we learn that it is, in fact, some sort of organism, on that they found on an asteroid when they were there for, mining purposes and doing the scans for life as you're supposed to. And they found this maybe silicon-based life thing that threw up flags. And so then they started studying it and trying to figure out what it was. And of course, the corporations went, oh, well, this is a weapon. How can we monetize this as a weapon rather than having that like good scientific curiosity, right? But that first bit about it being found on an asteroid is the first kind of like checkbox to, oh, this could be an extraterrestrial life form, right? We have the theory of panspermia is that life developed on Earth because all or at least some of the building blocks for life came and crashed into our planet early back in its formation from an asteroid or from some sort of extraterrestrial junk, got onto Earth and started developing. And so it's very reasonable that an asteroid could be carrying forms of life or building blocks of life. So that's kind of the first little bit where it's like, oh, yeah, this could be. The next reason why it seems like a fungus is that when we encounter it, you see, it's depicted in a few different ways throughout the show. It's, your long filaments of things that look, kind of gross and fungus-like. But then you see it where there's just it's just blue and bits of beautiful little spores of light just floating through the air. Spores, fungus, hey, there we go. And this is kind of, maybe bouncing a little bit farther through, but some of the other characteristics that made it seem like a fungus to me are that find out that it can actually communicate, the protomolecule could communicate with itself over distances, not just within its big local mycelial network, but also across planets. So when Holden and his crew from the Rocinante crash the Eros into, the remainder of the station into Venus, that becomes sort of the protomolecule hive mind, and then it's able to talk to the other bits of it throughout the rest of the solar system. And fungus actually can communicate like that. So mycorrhizal networks are basically one big nose, for lack of a better term, right? So any sort of molecule, sensory molecule, or anything that lands on any part of the mycorrhizal network can be taken into the fungus and interpreted as whatever it is, like, oh, hey, look, this is food, or oh, hey, that's a toxin or something, and it can warn the rest of its network. And they also think that, they've done experiments where you can take plants that are infected by aphids and plants that aren't infected by aphids, and the fungus can actually communicate between the two plants, even if the fungus isn't directly connected to both plants. It can actually send out volatile chemicals that says like, hey, there's a problem over here, and encourage the plant to ramp up its immune system. So the fact that this protomolecule could communicate over space is not really at all fiction. It's something that can happen. It's got fungal memory. So fungi can actually remember things, not necessarily in the way that we would think of as memories, but it can remember places that it had been. So there are a lot of characteristics. I will say, so the people who have read the book are going to go, they say that it isn't alive, it's silica-based, it's a machine, but what we talked about earlier, where we have to maybe expand our thinking of what life and what an organism is, we need to do here. So go with me. Like, I know they say it's not alive, but they also call it a virus a few times. So yes. I'm gonna go ahead and say that we're allowed to continue with my theory of fungus over virus.
Absolutely, I'm here for it. Let's expand the analogy as far as we can.
So,
yes. And the other idea was that I saw in the film, which immediately brought up memories for me, was they showed the blue fungus almost covering a nuclear reactor. Well, I assume it was a nuclear reactor, and you think to yourself, well, that's pretty clever. And then you Google Chernobyl fungus, and you realize that actually in very extreme environments around the world, you have specialized fungus, fungi that finds a niche and can survive and grow there.
Absolutely. They've done experiments with yeast, also with lichen. So lichen are a fungal, either algal symbiotic relationship, or it's a fungal bacterial symbiotic relationship. But lichen, if you blast them with radiation, you can actually, they can just take that radiation and turn it into energy. They can just photosynthesize if you take away other food sources for them. We found that we actually, NASA is doing studies where they are taking yeast and shooting it into space and watching what kinds of radiation the yeast are bombarded with and how much they're bombarded with to see how much radiation it can tolerate. Spoiler, so much radiation. And to see what sorts of mutagenesis that happens within the DNA of the organism. So, for example, when we send humans out on longer-term space missions, or, like the Expanse, when we go out into the belt and out past Ganymede and everything, humans are going to be exposed to more and different kinds of radiation. And so we need to know what sorts of damage can be done to humans. And so we're using fungus as an organism because they're very hardy, and we know we can send them into space and do things to them and get them back with minimal difficulty.
And what I love is I've seen a few descriptions of the proto molecule, which actually I've also seen independently, and many written in many years before this series, in people talking about their pet area of fungi research. So there's obviously in the book we plugged earlier on, there's discussions of people who say, well, they want to use the networks produced by these things for mapping. There's been evidence that's been done because they're very, very effective at quickly finding routes and through complex pathways. Computing was one, not like a wristwatch or like a personal computer, but more to do with the fact that as a sensory network, these things can be incredibly powerful. And if we can start working out how to utilize and access the data that the systems run on, we could begin to potentially more efficiently utilize webs of fungi map, particularly in large areas of agricultural land where we can see and detect things that are happening, because as you mentioned, a very effective sensor. It also has some relatively clever properties and skills. So there's reports of having mats on the ground outside or in wet woodwork, passing through 8 feet of concrete and then blooming in an oven. There's reports of cobblestones and those sorts of things being lifted up by the fruit because of the osmotic pressure. These things can be very large, but also they seem to have some really clever and interesting physical characteristics as well, which makes them quite appealing.
Yeah, well, and it's one of those things that it's a basic organism, but it has spent thousands of years evolving and doing these things. And so not only can we utilize fungi themselves for these types of things, for engineering, for computing, for, messaging around, but we can also base technology on those organisms. And so, why not make computing systems that send information in a similar fashion to fungi? Clearly, it's demonstrated to work through lots of different types of adversity and the hard situations. And why not take and adapt what we're seeing in the natural world to our technological world? And
that biomimicry is always a complicated one, because maybe the fungi have been watching this the past 50,000 years and going, right, now you've got network computing, you're finally starting to appreciate what we're all about. It's taken you that long to catch up. So it's not that so I think it's fascinating.
Well, I love that Merlin describes an experiment that somebody did where he had the fungus. He gave fungus a map of an IKEA floor layout and had the fungi figure out the most efficient route through IKEA.
Brilliant.
And it did quickly. It's maybe they're smarter than we are.
And that's to do with the wonderful ability to split and form webs, isn't it, very quickly, and then also sense when they're blocked and when their root isn't there, and then so very quickly they can leave from the edge and those sorts of things. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So there's a few characteristics that I was particularly interested in relation to the proto molecule that somewhere in the back of my mind it spoke to certain particularly parasitic type behaviors that you can think of examples of in nature. And then that also includes things like viruses and certain pathogenic bacteria as well. So the first one was this ability to harness not just energy, but organizational structures and integrate them into the system. So this was a bit like the blob from the 1950s, only the blob just made everything into big blob. This was building
a little more sophisticated.
Much like human intelligence, is recombining these things in new and constructive ways. And so let's talk a little bit about that, this idea of how particularly pathogens and parasites can harness things. So I guess at the virus level, it's clear that there's certainly a comparison to be made there in terms of the harnessing.
Sure.
Was there anything else that you sort of, it speaks to you in terms of thinking about things that are in the natural world that exhibit similar sorts of behaviors?
Yeah. So, it's viruses, they require human cells or animal cells or whatever they're infecting in order to reproduce. So viruses, you have to, without cellular machinery, viruses can't reproduce. So they were designed to do that, complete their reproductive process. Fungi don't, which is what's really cool about them. So they are generally extracellular. They survive outside without things. What's cool about them is that they can take and use. And when a fungus gets into a human body, it grows in all the different niches and places and can take the energy. And what you're probably referring to are the zombie fungi.
Obviously, yeah, I was obviously referring. Yeah, that's where I'm going. That's where we're going.
Where you could take. I'm here with you. We're both here for zombie fungi. So, but yeah, so we have numerous examples out in the environment of fungi that actually co-opt an organism for their own purposes. So things like ant, you can have, there's fungi that will infect ants and cause the ants to crawl up to the top of a blade of grass. So does the fungus care that it's in an ant and what? No, but that's how it needs to disseminate itself. And it is using the tools that it has evolved to use. And so we're still not really sure why this is possible. I mean, really, is it that the fungus is growing into the bits of the brain, quote unquote, those ants, or is it that it's a chemical ingredients that are being changed and being disrupted? We can kind of maybe think of a similar thing with humans and psychedelics, right? And so the research that we've been doing in the last the last decade, but going back several decades, on the use of psychedelics is that it looks like it's altering some of the brain chemistry or even some of the pathways in the brain that can kind of be restructured and reordered. And we're seeing that, people who have treatment refractory depression or PTSD can take psilocybin and be better. Wow. And it's wild, right? And so that, to me, also seems kind of like a similar sort of mechanism that it's the fungi are getting into our system and its chemical properties or whatever's happening is able to really rewire our systems and really just make these changes. And we don't really know what's happening. We don't know why it's happening in little zombie animals. Maybe we're being made zombies of fungus. Maybe the fungus controls us and this is all just a big, hallucination. I don't know.
But it's interesting, of course, because we don't seem to we don't have issues today. We did centuries ago getting our heads around it, but now we seem to understand, you say, the biome and the fact that your gut is the line where you end as an individual human and other organisms begin is not clear cut, and you are at the very least codependent with a vast array of microorganisms, and then evolutionary history, you can start pointing at certain components within cells or bits of the DNA where you go, actually, at some point that's come from somewhere else. And so you're a bit of a cacophony yourself. Yes. So there's lots of interesting things about that. And so mushrooms and those sorts of things, I guess it speaks to that broader thing about us thinking about the relationship between humans as organisms with other things in the world and the concept of pathogen and the concept of ecology and those types of things. And I know it feels a bit red wine, but it's actually a really interesting thing to explore and to start thinking about. I mean, the only thing I could think about just talking about the psychedelics is that, maybe catnip just backed the wrong horse, as it were. So maybe
it could be.
If the cats had taken over, like in Red Dwarf, maybe catnip would be the mass-produced product of choice now in the world, but unfortunately it was just had the wrong, it got the wrong alpha predator.
The
other interesting things that actually came up in the Merlin book but then got me thinking about this idea of you were talking about biomimicry, was things like some of the valve systems and pistons that mushrooms and those sorts of things, and obviously many organisms we see very clever things like physical dispersion tools, which are really clever.
Yeah.
And you would assume a uniquely human, or at least something that felt engineered, and then you realize that actually no, it's that process is actually naturally
evolution
as well.
had already figured it out.
Yeah. So I found that very, very interesting.
One of the, we've talked about the protomolecule so far as a pathogen, but one of the things that I think is that it's, humans, I think, have a tendency to assume a lot of the time that, this is a weapon or this is a pathogen. But I think, there's a quote by biologist Lynn Margulis is her name, and it's some of the most significant moments in evolution have resulted from the coming together and staying together of different organisms. So like you mentioned, mitochondria, chloroplasts, it's this endosymbiotic theory that allows organisms to basically skip evolution and absorb a ready-made trait. And so I think that the protomolecule is, it's not like any sort of fungus, parasite, virus, anything. It doesn't have a drive. It doesn't have a motive, right? It's not trying to take us over. But I think that humans could harness the protomolecule and, just like we've been talking about, and take bits of it into humans as a form of human enhancement, right? If we need to go and we need to travel the stars, we need to be hardier. If we're going to go live on different planets, we need to be able to terraform. We don't know what sorts of other space bugs we're going to encounter. We need immunity. We need things that are going to be able to live extracellularly. And what are those? Fungi. And so I think that we can actually, rather, if we stop thinking about the protomolecule as a weapon, as, what was sent here to destroy Earth. It was just sent to, do what fungi do, which is go and colonize new things. But I think rather than using the protomolecule as a weapon, we could use it for human enhancement. And we could have it help, maybe it can help augment human immunity. We see that, plants have their immune systems because of fungi. Maybe we could do that. We could have, maybe it can help with chemical production. Lichen can actually be, the reason that they can withstand such ridiculously high radiation is because they produce chemicals that are basically like their own sunscreen. So what if humans could just produce our own sunscreen, and we were able to obtain that from lichen, from fungi, from the protomolecule? There's a potential to use the protomolecule as a communication network. It's already doing it. Can we take and harness that and use it? Or can we learn from its structures and use it? Can we use it as a transportation network? I'm going to reference Star Trek Discovery here. They travel the mycelial network. Maybe that's what the protomolecule was also doing. And this gets a little, I don't want to get too far into this because it's going way into the series, but towards the end of the third season, I think if I've got my seasons right, it all blurs together. But, the protomolecule turns into the ring. And then the ring is this basically like wormhole that connects Earth and the solar system to thousands of other galaxies and planets. And so maybe that ring system is actually serving like a mycelial network and a transportation network. And humans and ships and everything have become energy in these networks, right? So I think that there's a lot of these fungal properties that we could potentially utilize as humans exploring space. And if we weren't also up in arms about like, oh, it's a weapon, and, oh, Mars can't have this, or the belt can't have this, and instead we all came together and said, how could we enhance humanity to travel the stars? I think that the protomolecule would actually be such a valuable tool. And for terraforming too, right? Like it goes out, it terraforms. That's what it seems to be made for.
So I'm with you, right? I mean, if I was to rewrite the series, which obviously they will have me to do at some point, I think you're exactly right. So I'm not sure at what point they decided it's a weapon. Whether actually it was initially a weapon is not clear, but the scientists basically say, oh, this was delivered from wherever they're coming for us.
They're assuming automatically it's a weapon instead of being curious.
If we were to rewrite it, that proto-molecule needed to basically absorb a salesperson or a PR person as soon as possible. Because to be frank, I mean, the optics for it were not great. No, I mean, it seems to, and when, well, I don't know. I mean,
because they get combined with children, right?
Not ideal.
Children who have immune disorders, and they still turn into these strange beings that her protogen, the company, wants to use as soldiers, right? So maybe, I don't know, would a salesman would it be able to override the protomolecule? I'm not sure. Because if kids couldn't do it, maybe they just weren't trained enough. I don't know.
That's true. But yeah, so it is something that basically would have softened the blow a little bit, because I mean, it didn't arrive in a particularly nice way. So one issue that, I mean, this idea of organism, it is a recurrent theme in sci-fi, but the idea of an organism which has been subject to its own independent evolutionary processes appearing on Earth or the solar system. And there's usually two variants of this. One is that it comes in and basically, like invasive jellyfish or whatever, just takes over everything. And then the other one is pretty good, but then like is allergic to water or those types of things.
Yeah.
And so I like that. And I've said I'm only a couple of series in, so I assume at some point they'll find some sort of because of course you can't have a series where the enemy is completely all powerful and undefeatable. So I'm assuming at some point they'll bring in some sort of Achilles heel for the thing that I think in War of the Worlds the aliens were not immune to the viruses and pathogens on Earth, so they succumb to that eventually.
Yes.
I think Signs or something was literally water, which was bonkers. You're like, so you've come to a planet which is like 80% water.
All water.
You didn't think that one through. Guys, come on.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. No, I mean, and it's a problem or it's not a problem, but it's a consideration for humans and space exploration, right? Like we are evolved to deal with things that we have encountered. So if we encounter space pathogen, not even pathogen, just space organism, what's the likelihood that the humans are going to actually be able to survive and deal with that? Not great. So we need to think about when we encounter things, that because we're going to encounter them eventually, how that's going to impact our systems. And is there anything that we can do to kind of rapid fire augment ourselves because we can't like vaccinate against everything. We can't even vaccinate really against unknowns on Earth. So how are we going to do that for space? It's definitely something interesting to think about, but it does also mean that many times organisms that we encounter may not be infectious to humans because we won't have the right cellular machinery, or we won't have the right temperature or whatever it is to sustain that extraterrestrial life. So it does go both ways.
We just won't be that tasty. They'll be like,
no, I don't think I think we're probably pretty stringy, right?
Yeah, they'll be like, no, you've got two eyes. You know, where's your telepathic? I bet the yeast only infects the sort of telepathic thing on the eye of the other alien species, so it comes over here. It's like, you're not got one of those. I am not interested.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. It's like the betazoids in Star Trek where they can't hear Klingon thoughts because their brains aren't evolved enough. Similar thing.
The other thing, I mean, we'll touch upon briefly, of course, is that in many ways, the history of fungi is one that is fringe in much of our mainstream. It's everywhere, much like fungus. It's everywhere, but it's kind of there doing its little thing quietly. In the history of biological warfare, there's certain ones that we know for sure that were developed for weapon use against things like crops, and I'm sure there are a host of other things explored and talked about that weren't necessarily developed. But it fascinates me as well that as you talk about that there are potentially it's a whole universe to be as in again, every field is a universe to be explored, right? That's the thing about science. Yes. Right? You go speak to a scientist in any subfield and they're telling you it's here.
Absolutely.
Build from here. It's going to be amazing.
Absolutely.
But for me, I think, again, it's coming off the back of this Entangled Life Call, which is brilliant. I had a similar sensation the first time I read about viruses. You read those books, you kind of get this recentering and you realize that some of the most basic heuristics as humans we come on to thinking about, we get a grasp, we can make things grow, we take that to be our understanding of biological organisms. But then you realize that actually many of them, how they actually function, those hidden processes are very difficult to comprehend. And in some respects, it reminded me that, biology is hard, like physics.
Yes.
This idea of, just because of the surface level, these things seem squidgy and malleable and accessible and usable. Below that is complexities which does not line up with how the human brain in this Stone Age evolutionary processes. So I thought that was really, really fascinating. And yeah, so I got a lot out of that as well. And the protomolecule, I think, is also this kind of, it captures this characteristic of Prometheus, like this endless imaginative creativity. So in some respects, there's always that saying, what's that coming over the hill? Is it a monster? No, it's always us. And so in this case,
always.
the threat is this unbridled ability to create and repurpose, which in some respects is a very human trait. So I found that quite interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's, it's us. It's the humans are the ones that put the protomolecule into the kids and made them these, hybrid organisms. And it's just, they see that it's just actually the protomolecule trying to work with what it had been given. It's not like, again, it's now you put it with a human and it becomes some sort of ragey killing machine. It's like, wait a second, you put me into a system that I'm meant to infect, cellular or subcellular organoids. Yeah. Now I'm in a whole complex human being, and it's just trying to break out of the constraints that it's been put in and figure out, like, okay, well, now how do I work with this thing? And so again, it's not the fungus that's the problem or the evil thing. It's really the humans that are trying to use it for gain. That's the problem. The fungus is just doing its natural thing. And the same thing with infections, the same thing with bioweapons. It's not the organism's fault. It's not evil. It's not anything. It's use, it's utility. And I think that's a lot of what we see in The Expanse is that, there's a lot. It's all about the war and the conflict, unless you look beneath that. And you focus on the protomolecule, you focus on the space exploration, you focus on what the scientists originally had been trying to study and observe with it. And there is always, despite humanity being the way humanity is, there are always the people, and especially the scientists, who are curious and want to learn and want to explore and want to harness things for the good of humanity. And so I think that there's, that current is in The Expanse throughout. And if you think about the protomolecule as an organism in space and humans just encountering it, I think that you can get a new kind of layer out of The Expanse in the show and the potential for, humans and exploration and things like that.
Well, I think we've done a really good tour there. I've really enjoyed wandering around. Many things to think about. We get quite philosophical in this one. I quite enjoyed that. It was very, very good.
Yes.
And I've really enjoyed learning about fungi. And now that's a whole new seam of books I'm sure I'll end up wandering down into. So thank you very much for that.
Absolutely.
And yeah, just to say thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been lovely speaking to you. And hopefully
thank you so much.
We'll see you on here again at some point in the future.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. This has been so much fun. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.